Hello, everyone. So great that you're coming out on a Friday to learn about segregation and how public policy uh, causes segregation, but maybe can also be a fix for us going forward. I'm so glad to be joined today by Jessica Trounstine, a professor of political science at UC Merced. She's going to be giving our main presentation. And we're also joined by Eric Payne of the Central Valley Urban Institute, and my colleague John Wizard, who is the policy director at YIMBY Law for the Campaign for Fair Housing Elements. So I'm excited to chat after the presentation and definitely look forward to your questions as well. So Jessica, feel free to take it away and share your screen, and
thank you.
Yeah, we'll see you afterwards.
Awesome. All right. Okay. I can't see you all, so if anybody needs to say something, just yell out. I'm gonna just get started here. So I'm Jessica Trounstine. I'm really excited to be here talking to this terrific group of people. I feel like I sit all day in my ivory tower and I think about stuff from an academic perspective, and it's really a thrill to be able to talk about my work to people who can make it matter. And so thank you so much for being here and for having me. So I wrote a book several years ago called Segregation by Design, Local Politics and Inequality in American Cities. And this was about a 10-year process writing this book. And it was motivated by a desire to understand why some people have access to good, nice surroundings in their neighborhood and other people don't have access to those things. Like, why do some people have good roads and other people don't, or good schools or nice parks and get their roads plowed when it snows? I was living on the East Coast when this developed. So that was the motivation for this book. And it turns out that sort of pretty quickly I learned that the answer to that question is segregation. And so I wrote a book about segregation, trying to understand how we got to where we are. And in order to help explain the story of segregation and the research that I conducted, I worked with an artist, Derek Ritter, who helped me turn the story of the book into a comic. And so I'm going to start my presentation by going through the comic. And if you want, you can download the comic. It's on my website. It's available. It's free. So I'm gonna start here. Meet Tom and Jen. And Jen is pregnant, and you can see this later on in the story with a baby Katie. And Tom and Jen are searching for a new house. They think that they want to live in Camden, New Jersey, and they have a long list of priorities. They want a house that's under $110,000. Don't laugh, it's Californians. This is the East Coast, remember? It's Camden. It exists. Houses under $110,000 exist. They want the neighborhood to have low crime. They want a good school for baby Katie. They want an older house that's been remodeled, that has charm, all things that seem perfectly reasonable on the face of it. And you can see here that they meet their real estate agent, Linda, who says, well, I'll do my best. So what happens is Linda takes Tom and Jen around to lots of different houses, and time and again, they're frustrated. They're frustrated with the houses that they find in Camden, not because there's anything wrong with the houses. They are cute and remodeled and have charm and all of those things, and they're located very close to the place that they want to be. What they say is that each of these houses has a problem. And the problem is with the neighborhood that the house is located in. So you can see some of their comments here. Oh, the school is rated only a 1 out of 10. I can hear the 670, right? There's a lot of crime in this area, and they get frustrated. So Linda suggests, have you thought about looking at homes outside of Camden? So they start looking in this neighboring town called Cherry Hill. And Tom immediately wants to know why Cherry Hill is so different from Camden. he says, you can't help but notice that all of the African-American population in this area lives in Camden, and Cherry Hill is really white. So what is this? Is it just racism? Or maybe it's just that some people have more money than others. And those are the two sort of common ways that people think about segregation, right? That it's driven by racism or it's driven by income inequality. And what Linda says is, that's not quite right, Tom. This isn't just about preferences. It isn't just about income inequality. It's about politics. And it isn't even really about individuals' choices at all, but the fact that local governments have institutionalized, have institutionalized racism, building it into the design of the cities themselves. And here, Linda begins to tell the history, the story of sort of segregation in America. And this is what I do as well in the book. And Linda says, what we don't know, why every decision was made, but what we can say is that it was, for sure, segregation by design. It was intentional, and it still is intentional. So how did we get here? Well, since the earliest days of US urban development, local governments have influenced property values and have strategically allocated benefits, public goods like road paving and parks and schools, to the benefit of the most politically powerful members of our society. Those are white property owners. Local politics at its core is the politics of land use, and it has been for more than 100 years dominated by white property owners who have used their wealth and control of allocation to benefit themselves and their families. And through land use regulation, zoning, and redevelopment, local governments have created segregation along race and class lines. So I'm just going to tell you probably a little bit of history that most of you already know, but it'll get us all on the same page here. So how have whites kept people of color out of their communities? Well, violence was historically a very effective means of keeping people of color out of white neighborhoods, involving individual attacks or bombings, right? Restrictive covenants, and here I have on the screen before you an example of a restrictive covenant, was another mechanism that white neighborhoods used to maintain exclusivity. And a restrictive covenant is an agreement that is written into the title of the house that says that nobody will sell this house or nobody can purchase this house who belongs to particular races, right? So the one I have up on the screen says that no tract shall be used or occupied by persons of any race other than the Caucasian race, except for domestic servants. There are other forms of restrictive covenants, but this is a very common sort of frame. And many of you will also know this, restrictive covenants still exist in many housing deeds. But in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that restrictive covenants could not be enforced by the government. Even still, when the deed has this language in it, it shapes the way in which housing gets purchased and sold over long periods of time. We also know from a lot of great research, mostly in sociology, that racial steering on the part of real estate agents is still very common. So real estate agents in certain places will not show houses to buyers of color that are located when the houses are located in white neighborhoods and vice versa. I actually had this experience when I moved to New Jersey. I wanted to buy an apartment, a condo, and I worked with a real estate agent, and it was crazy to me that she was not I had a very limited budget. I was a brand new assistant professor and I didn't have any money. And it seemed like there was all of these houses that were listed on, various websites that she was not showing me. And they were in my price range. And I said to her, "Why are you not showing me these houses?" And she said, "Because I wouldn't let my daughter live in that neighborhood, and I'm not going to show you those homes." And I fired her immediately and went and found myself a real estate agent who would show me those homes. But it's just a tiny example of the very small interactions that can happen and that add up to creating segregation. But state and local policies are where I have focused my research, and they can have the same sorts of effects as restrictive covenants and racial steering. So what you see before you here is a map of Atlanta from, it says 1920 on the map, but it's written in pencil there, but it's actually earlier than that. It's from the early 1910s. So several southern cities, including Atlanta, established separate Black and white neighborhoods using their zoning maps. And this map, it's maybe a little bit hard to tell, but you can see here, I'm gonna highlight with my cursor here, that this is an R2 neighborhood that is for colored, it's a colored district and dwelling. And then there are other areas that are located for white for white residents. The Supreme Court ruled this kind of zoning unconstitutional in 1917. But what I found in my research is that frequently cities that had established maps like this, where there was a separate district for Black and white residents, simply erased the Black or white label on the map, but kept the map basically the same. And what that did was that it signaled to people who were in the planning process and who were in the real estate process where the appropriate neighborhoods should be located. Cities also had other tricks up their sleeves. So a great example of one of these tricks is in Austin. So remember, at this time in the 1920s, schools were segregated. And so the Austin City Planning Department decided that at the time, Austin had a whole variety of different neighborhoods where Black residents tended to live. And they also had a fairly sizable Latino population at the time. They wanted to move the Latino population, and particularly the Black population, to a more concentrated part of Austin. And so they had meetings, and then they wrote lots and lots of memos about this, which are terrific for people like me who do historical research like this. What they did was they decided to close down all of the segregated schools, all of the schools for Black children in other parts of town, and move all of the schools for Black children to one segment of the town. And what they predicted, and it came true, was that families would follow because they wanted their children to live closer to the school. They wanted to be part of the school community. So again, this is a mechanism by which cities can use their land use regulation powers, their powers of public goods provision, to determine and influence where people are going to live in the city. These are maps that probably many of you are familiar with. These are redlining maps. So the federal government also generated policies that entrenched segregation. These are maps from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a New Deal program to spur home ownership and increase home ownership and spur construction. And what these maps did was solidify the practice of redlining. So the HOLC developed a system to evaluate the risk associated with giving a mortgage to somebody who wanted to buy or remodel a house in a particular neighborhood. And that's what you see. What you're looking at here is the risk. And the risk in green neighborhoods was seen to be very low. And the risk in red neighborhoods, hence the term redlining, was seen to be very high. So almost all of the loans that HOLC approved ended up in the federal mortgage program. Almost all of the loans were given to people, or were provided to people who wanted to buy or remodel homes in the top two categories. That's the blue and green categories on these maps. And they denied loans to people who wanted to purchase or remodel homes in the yellow and red categories. As the history of Atlanta that I just mentioned made clear, HOLC didn't invent these standards of racial worth, but it legitimized them and it put them into policy. It lent power and prestige, particularly the backing of the federal government, behind the systemic practice of racial exclusion. These federal redlining practices were in place as suburbs exploded with population in the post-World War II period. And as you might imagine, most suburbs were considered to be green and blue zones. And often, and I should have said this on the last slide, what determined whether or not a zone or an area was green or blue or yellow or red was the racial makeup of the people who currently lived in that neighborhood and whether or not there were restrictive covenants, and whether or not there was single family home zoning only. So places that had restrictive covenants in the deeds, that had single family zoning only, and already had white residents were classified by Hulk as green and blue neighborhoods. And places where people of color lived and where multifamily housing was located and where there were no deed restrictions were coded as red and yellow. And so here we are in the suburbs, which were mostly white, mostly wealthy at the time that these lending practices are occurring. And so suburbs got categorized as green and blue zones. So along with the fact that race and income are highly correlated in the United States, what this meant was that suburbs started out much whiter than their central cities and maintained their whiteness over time. This would change, of course. Many of you are sitting here thinking about suburbs that you know of that are incredibly diverse, both economically and racially. And that's true. We have diversified in our suburban communities, but there remain places that are overwhelmingly exclusively white and wealthy. And I bet you can all think of those places too. So where does this leave us? What this leaves us is with a legacy of two patterns of segregation. And I'm going to talk about those patterns in just a minute. So these two patterns of segregation are, I'm going to summarize them. A history where within a city, neighborhoods were segregated by race and class. And more recently, a pattern where whole cities are segregated from each other by race and class. So I'm going to show you some maps to help make that a little bit clearer. It's important from a land use and a planning perspective to understand these two forms of segregation because they're interactive. Here's a map of Camden, New Jersey in 1940. And what you're looking at here are the neighborhoods in Camden, and I've coded them. I'm showing you the Black population in each of these neighborhoods in Camden in 1940. So what you can see is that Camden has a very sizable Black population at the time, and there are neighborhoods that are definitely predominantly Black, but there are also neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly white. This is segregation that occurs within a city between neighborhoods. Now, we're going to move to a map of 1970 Camden over here on the left. And you can see now I'm showing you the larger metropolitan area with Cherry Hill on the right. And this is sort of the high point when segregation across city lines is really taking off. What you should notice in this map is that the suburb of Cherry Hill is almost exclusively white, and Camden has many more Black residents. But I want you to see one thing here, which is that there are these two neighborhoods in Camden at the very bottom and at the very top that are still overwhelmingly white. So Camden is a city that remains segregated by race, but it is also segregated from its neighbor, Cherry Hill. Now fast forward to 2011, and you can see that all of the white neighborhoods in Camden have disappeared. And Cherry Hill has become a little bit more diverse, just like the suburbs in California have become a little bit more diverse. You can see here in this pattern that the predominant form of segregation now in this area is between Camden and Cherry Hill rather than within either city on its own. Today, our land use regulations continue to reinforce segregation. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, it's that when land use regulations prevent change, however they do it, they are going to reinforce these earlier patterns of segregation, regardless of people's intent today. Even if people don't mean to live in segregated communities, when our land use regulations stick in place what was there before, they stick in place segregation. So here is a racial dot map. You can all go find the racial dot map for your own city by going to the Weldon Cooper Center. And this is where I've stolen the screen capture from. I didn't make this map. So this is showing you a racial dot map of a town in Northern California called Petaluma. You can see by these dots. And so the nice thing about a racial dot map is that it's showing you both the density of the population as well as the race of the population. You can see that the blue dots are sort of really spread out, and there's a few red dots in here too. Petaluma is overwhelmingly white, and there's a small Asian population. And then there are small clusters of Latino communities within Petaluma. Petaluma is a city that has fairly high internal segregation. These neighborhoods, the overwhelmingly Latino neighborhoods, also map on to land use regulation. So I want you to notice this one little neighborhood in particular, because I'm going to show you land use regulation just for this little area. Okay, there it is. So this might be a little bit hard to understand, but what I want you to get from this picture is the difference. Look at this surrounding area here where all of the houses are fairly spread out. There's lots of greenery. And then right here in this little triangle, we have a much denser housing. The center of the picture is this Latino population within Petaluma. Here is a racial dot map showing you that other kind of segregation, segregation between cities. So here, many of you will be familiar with this too. We have East Palo Alto, historically the only community open to Black residents in Silicon Valley. In recent decades, though, has become predominantly working class Latinx households, with many families living in dense apartment buildings. And you can see this dense concentration of yellow dots in East Palo Alto. And you can see how different that is and how divided this area is by that dark Black line of the city boundary. The cities of Menlo Park and Atherton and Palo Alto look very different racially from the community of East Palo Alto. And here is a picture of that land use. So again, what I want you to see here up in the upper right, we have East Palo Alto, and then this very clear border between the cities where we have predominantly single family homes with lots of greenery and very different patterns of land use. Residents in racially exclusive places like Palo Alto have come to expect that the land use regulations will protect the homes and the way in which the character that they have become familiar with is realized. And they have rationalized the sort of racial segregation of their community and inequality as the product of meritocracy, right? Conflating their exclusivity with high property values. So that's how land use regulation segregates cities. So what are the consequences here, and what can we do about it? Well, segregation generates inequalities. It generates inequalities on basically every dimension you can think of. So when a community is segregated, marginalized communities, neighborhoods that are heavily dominated by people of color and by lower income residents, have fewer resources, they have less access to the benefits that government provides. Segregation across city lines has meant that the benefits that are experienced by racial and ethnic minorities and low-income individuals are vastly inferior to the benefits that are experienced by people who live in the more exclusive communities. And I'm showing you here a picture of sewer overflows, which are much more common in the marginalized neighborhoods of segregated communities. The situation is not immutable, but it is difficult to address. And the first step toward policy solutions is to recognize, really, truly in our hearts, understand that segregation is purposeful. It is not an accident. The geography of our communities did not happen by accident. And the people who create segregation, who maintain segregation and benefit from segregation will always be the people who are the most opposed to undoing it. But undoing it is possible. One of the most important policy levers that we have is to integrate our housing stock and to prevent exclusive neighborhoods and cities from remaining off limits to lower income families. Lower income residents could also be given massive housing subsidies to allow them to move and to make choices. If breaching segregation proves unworkable or just vastly difficult, more can be done by state governments to spread and redistribute public goods, just as states have done with school funding. We could do the same for drinking water, right? We could allow communities that are under-resourced to have more resources by giving them money. garnering state support for desegregation, integration, or redistribution of public goods requires tremendous political pressure from marginalized groups and their allies, and it's an admittedly daunting task. However, these groups might find support from businesses and residents who've been priced out of unaffordable markets, which is why we're seeing some advances here in California. Advocacy groups, citizens organizations, and concerned policymakers must build coalitions to work for a more just and equitable desegregated society, because our future depends on it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we'll move on to the next part of our program here.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica. If I could just like shout and whoop and applaud, you know, without feeling super awkward in my living room, I would. That was really an elegant explanation of the problem. You know, I think that was something I wish I heard, you know, 10 years ago or 15 or 20 years, you know, just growing up, that should have been part of our core education for our young people. And so I look forward to a day when it is. And thank you for putting together such a really cohesive and interesting presentation. So we'll move into just a kind of group chat with our panelists right now. I'd love to hear from Eric and John. Anything that you guys that sparked interest for you guys. Also, I want to hand the mic quickly to Eric to do a quick introduction for you, and you know, talk about the Central Valley Urban Institute, what you guys do, and what you're excited about in Fresno right now. Before we start.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So just really quickly, I went to school and I grew up in Fresno, born and raised, and I graduated and went to Alabama A&M University, where I got a degree in biology and a master's degree in microbiology. And I thought I was going to go to medical school. And I ended up going into the classroom to teach. And I worked with a group of students who came from a really low income neighborhood, much like my own. And I had this realization that all the great work that I was doing with these young people, that there was somebody in my community that I came from that needed an adult ally like myself. So I packed my stuff up, I moved across the country, and I started working for an organization, youth development organization. And it was through that work and working with young people in my neighborhood who were working towards systemic change around complete streets and healthy access to fruits and vegetables and healthcare access. These young people gave testimony before the California state legislature, and it prompted me to run, they prompted me to run for public office. And I ended up being the youngest person to ever run for public office in the county. And I ran for the community college board because I recognized that had there been a college in my neighborhood, I probably would have stayed and went to my local college. But because they didn't have student housing and there were so many other barriers to success for me, my only options were to go across the country to in an environment that would nurture me as a Black student, because I didn't grow up. I grew up in a really diverse community. And so I ended up becoming the youngest elected official, not just in my community, but I was the youngest community college trustee elected in the country. And it was through that work that I learned the importance and value of community and engaging residents in the participatory process of public decision making. And I served 8 years on the community college board, and in that phase, I founded the Central Valley Urban Institute with community because the state decided that they were going to invest a lot of cap and trade dollars in my neighborhood. We have some of the highest levels of concentrated poverty in the country, and we suffer from poor land use decisions by our local municipality. And what does that look like? That looks a lot like what we've been presented today. I served as chair of the general plan committee for the city. I was appointed by the mayor. And I use my background as a scientist to integrate data and problem solving into public policy, but with the lens and focus of community. And through that, I was able to work with residents in my community, and we pushed back. We pushed back in a really big way because the California EPA EnviroScreen showed that the social determinants of health were disparagingly different between North Fresno and South Fresno, and I lived in South Fresno. And that community was really what we would call the tale of two cities. There is huge investment in a mall and movie theaters and park space and green space and multiple access points for healthcare treatment. You had some of the newest single family development housing. Then you look at my neighborhood that had not seen new single family housing development since the Great Depression. A general plan that specifically outlined that Black or the African American and African American families could not live on the other side of the train tracks. And so when my family migrated to California in the 50s, they went to where they could purchase a home, which was in South Fresno. They had some of the worst water systems, some of the worst public infrastructure. When we talk about sidewalks, when we talk about public access, public education, my elementary school was under state receivership. It had some of the lowest performance rates in the state, some of the highest crime rates in the country. And residents really changed that narrative through our work and engaging through the land use process. And so we were able to change an industrialized community that was saturated with industrial development into mixed use multifamily, single family housing. And now the state has proposed $300 million in investment. We now have a new community college coming into our neighborhood. We have new single family housing coming into the neighborhood, new multifamily housing coming into the neighborhood, and commercial development that's going to have a 12-acre park. And these were things that were missing from our community. And it was because of the advocacy of my neighbors, my family, and my friends that we were able to really change the narrative and the outcome of this huge public investment to ensure that families that look like me could stay in their homes. And as the Silicon Valley folks come into the valley to purchase new property, that the property values and taxes, that people are not priced out. And so now our new fight is the city council is looking to change the land use designation of one of the industrial developments that we had rezoned for multifamily, single family, commercial mixed use development. And so we are at the forefront of that fight. And so we will pursue litigation. We are working with some great partners at the Western Center on Law and Poverty. And you have a lot of folks who are committed to ensuring equity, justice, and fair inclusion of some of the most marginalized residents that live in poverty. So again, I hope that paints an accurate picture of what we've discussed and what's been presented this morning, and making it practical. That a kid from, I always say I'm just a guy from the hood trying to do a little bit.
That's awesome. I mean, I think what you're painting is exactly right. Right on. It's the continuation of that historic pattern playing out, and I think the ability for us to access data to demonstrate the differences between those, either between towns, like Jessica was saying, external segregation or internal segregation, and seeing the kinds of things like, public services, environmental, like the EnviroScreening, great data tool, to kind of show those differences in a way that is not anecdotal, right? That is based in science and, and that has real deep implications for our health, like the health of our bodies, our mental health, and the access that we have to opportunity. Let me pass the mic to John and see if you have any, response to the presentation and some thoughts you have on this content.
Yeah, I was very interested to hear sort of that connection that Jessica shared from then to now. I agree with you, other Jess, that it would have been just transformational to hear that arc through, in high school or even undergrad, whether that's your first or second year at community college or at some time in some required course when you're in college. But because not everybody goes to college, I think that's why I started with high school. But just an awareness of the underpinnings, the foundation of so many of society's ills today. And to say that differently, we are in the mess we're in a lot of places because of choices that were made intentionally 50 years ago. And 50 years ago is really not that long. And so, sure, 100 years ago, like Jessica's maps, of course, there was things that were happening in the 17 and 1800s, but Jim Crow laws, there are people alive who lived through that. It wasn't that long ago, and we continue to do those sorts of things. So just as a very quick anecdote, I'll share that here on the Monterey Peninsula where I'm at, we had Fort Ord, and Fort Ord was the first Army base to integrate and allow soldiers of different races and ethnicities to have the same jobs. Despite that occurring in the 1910s, I think, as those restrictive covenants were kind of peeled back, the Army still perpetuated this system, this almost this caste system here on the Monterey Peninsula, where they would tell flag officers, general officers, you want to go live in Carmel. That's where people like you are. And then they would tell staff officers, captains and majors, you want to go to Pacific Grove, you want to go to Monterey. And then they would tell Black soldiers, you want to go to Seaside. They would tell Filipino soldiers and Asian soldiers, you want to go to Marina. And that system continued until the base closed in the mid-90s. And so today, largely, Carmel, Pacific Grove, and a couple of those, Monterey, are very white. Seaside was a historically Black community, and it still has the largest concentration of Black people anywhere in Monterey County, and is sort of the fulcrum point of the Black community between the LA and San Francisco regions. And Marina has a huge population of isolated language isolation and first generation Asian people who fish and have markets and restaurants, because that's where that sort of agglomeration of community is. And it's just so surprising to me that even when there is affirmative laws that prevent this type of behavior, even when it's codified that it's criminal to do these things, we still find ways to perpetuate these systems, whether directly, intentionally, or because that's just what we're familiar with, and it happens almost on autopilot.
Yeah. I want to ask kind of a question to the group, and maybe you guys will all have different takes on this, but something that Jessica said in the presentation caught my ear is this need to have a loosening of regulation to some extent, to have the freedom to adapt to new norms and to new goals, right? And we have the goal right now to affirmatively further fair housing in California, and that goal is often hampered by our zoning code, which is a really rigid set of regulations, right? And that there's a sense, I think, in some regulators that regulations are there to protect. The rigidity and the non-changeableness is a protection, from like fast changes that might, disrupt things. But I do think we're at a time when we're over crystallized, right? Like it's too rigid for us to actually grow and adapt to where we are in 2021. And so I'm curious what your thought is, that like that balance between protection through regulation, but needing the freedom to change and grow into who we are now.
Well, since I said it, I can sort of say a little bit more about that. So, you know, California has the demographic change in California over the last 50 years has been phenomenal, right? We've grown a lot, you know, just in terms of number of people, and we've become a much more diverse place, and we've become a much more unequal place. And as demographic change occurs, if your land use doesn't keep up with the changes in the population, then you drive up housing prices and you maintain and recreate segregation. That's what happens, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think we do need more flexible land use policy. It's the thing that needs to be more flexible, though, are the exclusive communities. Frequently, what we do is we tell marginalized communities, you need to accept more apartment house complexes. You need to change in this way. You need to become denser. You're a transit stop. So now we're going to build a whole bunch of new development where you are. What needs to happen is that Woodside, Beverly Hills, Atherton, the places that are the most exclusive need to be less exclusive. I mean, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly that there is this sort of longstanding phenomenon that multifamily housing or rental housing must be located where there's already hold on, I apologize. My dog recently hurt his back and he's trying to jump off of a surface, so that's not really great for our conversation, but we'll save his spine. He's a dachshund and they're fragile. Anyway, this longstanding idea that we have to continue to saturate communities with low income housing and affordable housing, multifamily housing, because that's where it already is, so that's where it already works. And the idea that we could sprinkle a little bit of money into those communities and that they would transform themselves is not based in reality. And it also presumes that there's something wrong with that community, and they just, you know, if you just water the plant, they'll grow. And it doesn't recognize that the hoarding of resources and that wall of policy has to be penetrated, it has to be broken apart, has to be dismantled, and we need to give people opportunities to live in those places, to realize the benefits that are physically located in those places. You know, if to have food deserts, to have hospital deserts, to have you know, like in Seaside, our general fund is, you know, roughly $1,000 per capita. So, you know, we have about 35,000 people and our general fund's about $37 million. A lot of our parks haven't had water on the grass in years because we can't afford the water bill when we're trying to pay for firefighters and try to run a parks program and try to provide you know, planning services. We have 2 planners for a city that's has active entitlements for a 1,500 unit 80-acre development. So, you know, we're just really behind on a lot of things, but the idea that we would pay $160,000, $200,000, $250,000 a year to water the parks, it's just not a priority in our community. But next door in Monterey, you know, their general fund is 3.5 times the size of ours for less people. So how do we you know, in the state policy lens, when we talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, how do you have that conversation around, we need to create opportunity for people in other places, but we, Seaside, we can only control what happens in Seaside. And the state has purposely weakened the Housing Community Development Department, the Treasury and the controller and the various financing mechanisms to be able to give money to, but not control. Okay, Monterey, you must do this. Okay, Carmel, you must do that. And so, you know, extrapolating that out, Clovis does not have to do anything when it comes to Fresno. Fresno is Fresno and Clovis is Clovis. So it's going to be hard for Fresno to say, well, Clovis, you need to tear down the wall and we need to have, free movement and greater opportunity for everybody, because Clovis doesn't want to share its resources. I think that's been made pretty clear over the history of their local government. So, these things are very complex, and there's no way to just like wave a magic wand. But a phrase that I heard when I was much younger was that like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and expecting new results. And that's why this paradigm shift in public policy on access to opportunity, I think, is really going to be the off-ramp to decades of bad public policy.
I want to go back to something Eric pointed out, and actually Greg mentioned in the chat as well, is that when we talk about opportunities for housing, we do want a wide menu of things. It can't be a silver bullet or a one size fits all for this community, right? And that rentals are great. Like rentals have been a very close part of my life. But I think there is, advantages to the wealth creation and the security that comes through ownership products. And, and so I really appreciate that Eric kind of mentioned that in his in his list of things, is that, yes, we do need multifamily. We need density, especially near, our sort of human amenities like schools and transit. But we also want to give folks of all communities access to, to ownership and stake in their housing options. And Eric, I'm curious if you have any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think as you look at the integration of multimodal transit options in communities, right? So pedestrian walkways, bike lanes, EV shared options, and also integrating in housing is important, because you need a diversity of housing stock available, from public housing to all the way to single family, multifamily. You need senior housing for those that can age in place. I think that all of those things really make community. And if you are only catering to the mega rich and large corporations to disenfranchise some of our most vulnerable populations in our community, we're not doing our due diligence, and we're not doing our communities any justice. One of the things I think that more often than not folks lean on is our justice system. And one of the things that we recognize in our justice system is that our justice system doesn't always favor folks that look like you and I in this conversation. And when we talk about integrating communities of opportunity, there's significant pushback, because sometimes those folks are the judges. Those folks are your elected officials. And so it's important to know and important to be able to tell that story in a very public way when you have these very public conversations.
Yeah, man, I think it comes out often is just like, who are the ones making the decisions? And do they have the sort of life experience to actually speak to the community's experience that they're making decisions for? And I think it'd be it'd be interesting if, and I don't think it's legal or whatnot, but I think it'd be interesting if it was like, if you're in the housing department, you have to be a renter or have had, this many years of experience as a renter. I mean, that's not really, don't know if that's if that's some sort of violation of something, but I just think that when we ask for someone's experience, it's like, what's your work experience? How much education have you been able to afford? Not, what are the life experiences that you've had, and how will that translate into how you make decisions for the group? So anyway, just an aside there about future hiring practices that will happen in 10 years. I wanted to ask Jessica if you've heard of any cities doing kind of what you said towards the end of actually recognizing the historic mistakes that we've made and crystallized into our housing policy and land use policy. I think that, you know, part of diagnosing a problem is really understanding, you know, getting your hands around it and recognize, saying it out loud, right? Like acknowledging it. And I think I can, you know, there's very few cities that I've heard say out loud that like our current zoning map was made in a time where we had sort of racist notions and we need to make moves to correct that. I'm hoping for a day when all cities do that. I'm curious if you have any examples of cities who are kind of going through that reckoning and diagnosing the problem so that they can do better in the future.
So I should know lots more examples of this, but the most prominent example probably everybody knows about is Minneapolis, right? It has their city council made a declaration that their land use practices were based on historically racist policies. It was a predominantly single family zoned community. And so they have upzoned the entire city. So now triplexes are allowed everywhere. It remains to be seen whether that will actually produce integration or diversity in, you know, in development. So John mentioned Clovis earlier. Clovis has an overlay, has a density overlay for the whole city. You could build, you know, 30 units per acre anywhere in Clovis, theoretically, right? The problem is that there are lots of different aspects of the land use process that restrict the way in which development happens and ultimately can exacerbate gentrification and exacerbate segregation that aren't just captured by single family versus multifamily zoning, right? So I presented that as sort of, it's the easiest thing for everybody in this room to get their mind around, but it's certainly not the only thing. And there are lots of different aspects of land use regulatory process that can produce and reproduce segregation and create marginalized communities. And one of them happens to be public comment. So the more public comment you allow in your process, in your land use process, and you know, we started public commenting, sort of adopting public commentary as a practice in our planning department starting in the 1960s and then really taking off in the 1970s for good reason. There was lots of people were getting left out of the process. But it's been, political scientists can talk all day about sort of how advantaged people are advantaged in every stage of the political process. And we're now understanding more about how advantaged people are advantaged in the planning process too, because they're the ones who have time to go to the planning meetings, who have, you know, serve on the planning commission, who's, you know, can, all of these things. And you guys mentioned before having more renters in public office. We just have a brand new study on this, not me, from friends of mine. Renters are underrepresented, are more underrepresented in public office than people of color or women are, any other marginalized group that you can think of. Renters they're phenomenally underrepresented in office at the local level, state level, and at the national level. So I know we're basically out of time, so I want to stop talking.
Just real quick for the group, that local example for us is Sacramento. In their recent ordinance updates to allow upzoning their residential neighborhoods to allow up to fourplexes, they explicitly called out and identified findings about their, you know, the redlining in Sacramento and the history of racist land use to substantiate why they wanted to pursue this change. So a little closer to home, but very much along the same lines.
Definitely. I think that recognition verbally, right? Not just internally and saying like, well, you know, we as the professionals recognize this, so we'll just go about our task, but to really recognize that externally, so that, you know, your constituents, your residents can all hear that and hear that, you know, that humility of saying like, hey, we're working to fix mistakes that we've made in the past. I hope that's the direction that we're going as a culture, for sure. Because I think, you know, just another word that I liked that Jess mentioned is, keeping the status quo is legitimizing those practices. There is, a bias towards status quo, right? There's not a bias towards change. And so when we accept that, when we accept the bias towards the status quo, we're legitimizing those racial tendencies that we've experienced in the past. And I think by, recognizing externally that we want to do better, it can help to break down that bias. So we are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for joining. We are recording this and it will be available for viewing later. Definitely go check out the comic. I'm so excited about that. I love graphic novels, and I think presenting the information that way as a narrative really, I think, brings the audience in, and I think, accessibly in a way that, I could send to my family and they could understand. So appreciate when planners take the effort to do that and to make, knowledge more accessible. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. It's so good to see you, and I hope that we'll be working with you a lot more in the Central Valley. It's really exciting to me to do Central Valley work. John, thank you as always. Love working with you. And thank you again to Jessica Trounstine for joining and presenting. And yeah, just very grateful for everyone's work, and keep it up. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much. This was really, really enlightening. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, thank you all. Great job.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, John.